The wilderness stretched into forever. Snow rolled over the land like a white ocean, burying everything in its cold and merciless tide. The trees stood dark and skeletal, black fingers clawing at the sky. Above, the heavens loomed in a sheet of dull steel, the color of hammered iron, heavy with the promise of storms. Into that endless, pitiless expanse moved a solitary figure, small against the vastness, fragile against the weight of winter, a young frontier woman, no more than 20 years in age, but carved already by hardship into something older. Her face was weathered by frost and wind, her hands were calloused from rope, trap, and axe. Her coat was stitched from worn hides, patched in places where years of labor had torn it thin. Her boots sank deep into the snow with every step, crunching through silence so absolute that it pressed upon her ears like a weight. She carried a rifle slung over one shoulder, though its stock was scarred from long use. Across her back, a small pack rattled with the bare tools of survival. An axe head, a coil of line, a handful of traps, and not nearly enough food. Out here, in this country, nothing was ever enough. The land gave little, and when it did, it demanded blood in return. Her camp was no true refuge, a canvas sheet stitched to a frame of green wood, a fire pit dug deep into snow, blackened with soot, a circle of bare earth beneath her where she slept at night, pressed close to the flame, praying that the coals would not die before dawn. Each day began before the light. She rose to cold so sharp it cut the breath in her chest and forced her hands to stir fire from dying embers. Her body ached, but there was no room for weakness. Weakness was a luxury she could not afford. She strapped crude snowshoes to her boots and set out into the frozen stillness, her traps slung across her shoulder, her rifle heavy in her grip. Out across the white expanse, into the timber where rabbits might still run, where foxes might pass, where wolves circled unseen. Sometimes her snares held bounty, a hare, a squirrel, enough meat to stretch one more day. More often the loops were empty, the snow around them unbroken, the silence absolute. Each failure pressed deeper, each empty snare another reminder that this land owed her nothing. Still she endured, step after step, day after day, moving, hunting, mending, waiting. The silence grew thick around her, the kind of silence that was alive, the kind of silence that pressed on her mind until she found herself whispering aloud just to hear her own voice. She was alone, truly and utterly. No town, no rider, no hand to help if she faltered. The nearest settlement lay far beyond the horizon, weeks away even in good weather, and these were not good days. The wind picked up in the afternoons, sharp and bitter, dragging snow from the treetops and sending it whirling across her path. At night, the cold deepened until even the fire seemed powerless, its flame shrinking to a frail glow against the vast dark. She curled tight, clutching her rifle as if it could hold back the loneliness, as if steel and wood could shield her from the silence. She had chosen this life, or perhaps it had chosen her. Either way, she understood the truth that every frontier soul carried in their bones. Nature owes nothing. It did not care for her age. It did not care for her strength. It did not care for her will. It would strip her bare, piece by piece, until only the strongest part of her remained, or until nothing remained at all. For now she moved with rhythm, a fragile balance, a pattern of survival. Rise, gather wood, hunt, check lines, return, eat little, sleep less. Rise again. But the wilderness does not allow balance forever. The wilderness waits, it watches, it learns where one is weakest. And then when the moment comes, it strikes. The young woman could not yet know it, but this season the land would test her as it had never tested before. It would strip her to bone and spirit. It would demand everything she had, and more. The silence grew heavier. The wind keened through the timber. Snow shifted beneath her boots. The land was waiting, and her final struggle was about to begin. The wilderness was not empty. It was alive with secrets, and every secret carried a threat. The young frontier woman moved slowly through the timber, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her traps biting into the strap that cut across her chest. Each breath curled white in the freezing air, drifting upward until it vanished among the bare black branches above her. The ground crunched beneath her snowshoes, the sound echoing through silence so vast it felt like trespassing. She stopped often, kneeling to study faint marks in the snow. A thread of tracks, a whisper of passage. Here, a rabbit had moved through at dawn. There, a fox had circled warily, leaving no catch behind. Every detail mattered, every clue was the thin edge between hunger and endurance. The land was sharp, not sharp with beauty, but with edges meant to cut. Frost bit her fingers through worn gloves. The trees cracked in the cold, loud and sudden as rifle fire. The rivers lay hidden beneath hard ice, but even that strength was a lie, for the water ran fast below, waiting to claim the unwary. Her traps were spread wide across this country. Each day she checked them, each day she hoped. More often than not, the snares were empty, their loops stiff with frost, their bait frozen hard. Sometimes a rabbit trembled there, thin-furred and starving itself. A meager catch, but enough to quiet the gnawing in her belly for a night. But hunger was never far behind. Food stores dwindled. Every bite of dried meat became a calculation. Should she eat now or wait for tomorrow? Should she ration for strength or starve for endurance? The body burned fuel even in stillness. Each heartbeat consumed what little she had left. At night, she gnawed at scraps of sinew, boiled thin strips of hide to trick her stomach into believing it had eaten. She drank melted snow, though it gave no warmth, no strength, just water, just survival. The silence grew heavier in those hours. Lying in the dark, curled close to a weak fire, she felt the weight of the wilderness pressing down on her chest. The loneliness was louder than any wolf's howl. It whispered at the edges of her mind, promising that she was already lost, that no footsteps would ever cross hers again, that this place would be her grave. But she did not yield. She could not yield. Each morning she rose with trembling limbs and pushed herself into the cold once more. Her traps needed tending. Her lines needed mending. The work did not care for weakness. The storms grew harsher with each passing day. The wind cut sideways through the timber, filling her tracks as fast as she made them. The snow deepened until every step was labor. She leaned into the force of it, her body bending, her eyes narrowed against the stinging cold. The wilderness tested her, it starved her, it pressed against her lungs until her breath came shallow and ragged. Still, she endured. She remembered what her father had once told her long ago, when she was still small, when her hands had not yet grown calloused from work. The land gives nothing, but it teaches everything. She carried that truth now, though the voice was only memory. She carried it as fuel, as spark, as shield. But even as she fought to hold her place in this frozen world, the balance grew fragile. Every empty snare, every withered flame, every hollow ache in her belly brought her closer to the edge. The wilderness was patient. It would not need to strike quickly. It would wait, and it would take from her piece by piece, and soon it would strike its first true blow. The day began like all others. Grey light crept across the horizon, washing the world in colourless haze. The young frontier woman stirred the fire, coaxing faint flame from coals that threatened to vanish into ash. She rose stiffly, hunger gnawing hollow at her belly, and strapped her snowshoes in place. Another day of work, another day of survival. The sky held no storm, but the cold pressed sharp against her skin, deeper, heavier than the days before. Her body felt brittle beneath it, as though the land was testing her strength with each breath. She moved steadily, following the river's edge, hoping to find tracks where animals came to drink, to test her traps where she had set them among the alder and willow. The river lay white and still, its surface hard with ice, a mirror of frost stretched from bank to bank. She had crossed this place many times before. She trusted it. She read its frozen skin with practiced eyes, judged its strength by color and sound. To her, this crossing was routine, but the wilderness does not forgive trust. Her snowshoe pressed forward, and the sound came sharp, final, merciless. A crack, then another. The world fell out from beneath her feet. The ice shattered. She plunged down, waist deep into water colder than death. The shock tore the breath from her lungs in an instant. It was not water, it was knives, blades of cold driving into her flesh, stealing all warmth in seconds. Her body convulsed, hands flailing, desperate to cling to something, anything. She clawed at the jagged edges of ice fingers, slicing open on frozen shards. But she hauled herself forward, dragging her chest across the surface, kicking, clawing, pulling, until at last she spilled onto the far side, soaked and trembling. She lay there, gasping, her body racked by violent shivers. The water in her clothes hardened instantly, her coat stiffening into ice, boots freezing solid to her feet. Her pack hung heavy, its contents sodden and ruined. The fire kit within, her lifeline, was wet, the powder soaked, the flint dulled. The wilderness had struck, and it had struck with precision. She rose to her knees, her teeth rattling so hard they felt as if they might shatter. Every muscle locked with cold, fighting her own command to move. She knew the truth. If she stayed still, she would die. The cold would claim her within minutes, dragging her into stillness, into silence, into snow. She forced her body to stumble forward, forced her legs to carry her to the shelter of trees. She tore at her coat, peeling frozen fabric away from her skin, wringing water from sleeves and hems. Her fingers moved clumsy, thick, numb, as though they belonged to someone else. She tried to build fire. She gathered bark and brittle twigs, stacking them with care, striking her flint again and again, but the spark was weak, damp. Every flicker died before it caught. The cold pressed closer, swallowing each attempt, mocking her effort. Her hands shook so badly that the steel slipped. Her breath came ragged, chest heaving, lips cracked and bleeding. Still she tried. Again, and again, and again. Each failure a nail in her coffin. At last, with trembling persistence, a flame caught. Small, frail, but real. She bent low, cupping her hands to shield it from the wind, feeding it fibers of bark, strands of moss, twigs as thin as her fingers. The flame grew, weak but steady, a single thread holding her to life. She huddled close, stripping what she could from her body, laying her boots beside the fire, watching steam rise from the leather as water hissed into the air. She rocked slowly, clutching her knees, her whole body shivering so violently it seemed it might break itself apart. Her food was ruined. The dried meat now damp and useless, the small pouch of flour turned to paste, the fire kit half spoiled, the traps warped and frozen. The wilderness had not merely struck at her body, it had struck at her survival. And deep within, beneath the shivering, beneath the hollow ache of hunger and the shock of cold, she felt the first stirrings of something darker. Not fear, not despair, but the awareness that she had crossed a line, that she was no longer simply surviving. She was now in her last stand. Every step from this moment forward would be stolen. Every breath would be contested. The wilderness had begun its war against her, and it would not stop until she fell. The young woman curled closer to the flame, its light flickering weakly across her hollow face. Her eyes stared into the darkness beyond, wide and unblinking. The shattering had come, and with it, her unraveling began. The fire sputtered through the night, its glow weak, its warmth fleeting. The young frontier woman clung to it as though it were the last light in the world. And in truth, it was. Without it, there would be only the endless dark, the endless cold, and death waiting with silent patience. Her body trembled still from the river's cruelty. Her clothes hung stiff, dried only by fire and desperation. Her boots steamed as they hardened, cracked from frost, softened by heat, then frozen again when carried back into the snow. The water had stolen not just warmth, but strength. Her limbs were heavier now. Her chest ached deeper, and the ache of hunger cut sharper than ever. The ruined pack lay open before her, dried meat soaked through, a sodden lump of decay. Flour turned into frozen paste. A small pouch of salt lost to the water. Her fire kit weakened, its powder spoiled, its tools dulled. The very bones of survival had been snapped in a single stroke. She salvaged what she could, a strip of jerky, half edible, a handful of pine needles gathered, steeped in boiling water for faint strength. She gnawed the rim of hide she once meant to use for lashing. Food was no longer food. It was anything the body might accept, anything that would stave off the hollow gnaw for another hour. The traps had to be checked. They had to. Survival demanded it. Her body begged for rest, but she lashed snowshoes to her feet, gripped her rifle, and moved into the bitter wind. Each step was labor, each breath pulled thin through cracked lips. She moved because stillness meant death. The traps stood empty, one after another, loops stiff with frost, baits untouched, no tracks, no signs of life. Even the forest itself seemed emptied, the animals gone to burrows deep below, or vanished to safer ground. The silence mocked her. The emptiness scorned her. Her body weakened. The fire within her burned fuel it did not have. At night she curled close to fading coals, her ribs sharp against her skin, her belly caved and hollow. She chewed leather, boiled scraps of sinew into tasteless broth, swallowed pine bark shavings that sat heavy in her stomach, anything to trick the body, anything to stay alive one more day. But hunger is not easily deceived. Hunger whispers louder each day. Hunger gnaws at bone, rattles the teeth, presses behind the eyes until thought itself grows slow. She woke dizzy, her hands trembling. She moved through fog, her steps faltering. Her rifle grew heavier by the mile, her traps heavier by the step. Her face hollowed, her cheeks sank, her breath wheezed shallow, more frost than air. Still, she endured. She forced her body to move because the wilderness demanded it, and she knew this truth. If she stopped, she would never rise again. The loneliness deepened with hunger. At night, the silence seemed to creep closer, wrapping around her like a noose. She spoke aloud into the dark, not for answers, but for proof that she still had a voice. She laughed once, hollow and sharp at the sound of herself. It frightened her, that laugh. It sounded too close to madness. She dreamed of food, of warmth, of voices she had not heard in years, dreams so vivid that waking became torment. Each returned to reality, a blade across the heart. The wilderness took even her rest, replacing it with longing too cruel to endure. Days blurred. Her traps yielded little, her snares snapped by wind, her firewood damp with frost. Every task became a mountain, every movement an act of defiance against the land itself. The wilderness was patient. It knew hunger would do what storms could not. Hunger would carve away her strength. Hunger would make her careless. Hunger would hollow her until only the smallest spark remained. And in that hollowing, it whispered, "You are alone. You are starving. You are fading." The young frontier woman pressed her back against a tree one evening, her body shaking, her rifle across her knees. She stared into the white horizon, her lips split, her eyes sunken but burning. She did not cry, she did not beg, she only breathed, she only endured, because there was nothing else left to do. The scarcity was upon her, and with it the wilderness pressed her closer to the edge. The young frontier woman rose each morning with a hollow chest and shaking limbs. Hunger had eaten at her body until she moved like a shadow. But now another enemy sharpened its claws. An enemy no trap could catch, no rifle could stop. The wilderness itself turned inward, the silence became alive, and isolation pressed against her like a living weight. The forest was no longer merely still, it was oppressive. The sound of her breath seemed loud, her heartbeat thunderous in her ears. She became aware of every creak of her joints, every snap of twigs beneath her boots. Alone, she heard herself too clearly, and the absence of another voice, the absence of a single human sound, gnawed at her sanity. At night, the silence grew unbearable. The fire whispered in small bursts, but when the flames died low, the shadows crept close. She began to feel them watching, though she knew nothing lived there. Yet her eyes searched the dark, over and over, as if something might emerge. Dreams became cruel. She dreamed of faces, of warmth, of voices calling her name. She woke reaching into emptiness. She woke to the hiss of wind against canvas, to the brittle crack of trees, to her own shallow breathing. Each waking was a fall from a cliff, a reminder that she was alone in a land too vast for human company. Her mind began to play tricks. She thought she saw movement on the horizon, only snow twisting in the wind. She thought she heard footsteps behind her, only the echo of her own stride. She thought she smelled smoke in the distance, only the phantom scent of memory. The wilderness had found a new way to strike, not through claw, not through storm, but through the unraveling of thought. Her body weakened further, the cold cut deeper. Her ribs pressed hard against her skin, her hands grew numb even near the fire, but the isolation was worse. It gnawed at the spirit. It whispered that she no longer belonged to the world of the living, that she had been forgotten, left to fade into the snow as though she had never existed. She began to talk to objects. A scrap of hide became her companion for a moment. A stick in the fire seemed to answer her thoughts. She caught herself whispering thanks to a caught rabbit, whispering curses at the wind, whispering prayers to the silence itself. But the silence never answered. The forest around her seemed endless. No matter how far she walked, no matter how far she pushed into the white, there was no sign of another soul. The horizon stretched forever, a cruel reminder that the world was vast enough to swallow her whole and never notice. One evening, as snow drifted heavy, she sat hunched near the fire, her body nearly too weak to rise again. Her eyes traced the smoke curling upward, her breath shallow and ragged. For a moment, she thought she saw her mother's face in the smoke. For a moment, she thought she heard her father's voice. For a moment, she almost rose to greet them. But it was only illusion. Only longing twisted into shapes by a starving mind. And yet, despite the madness, despite the shadows, despite the silence pressing tighter with every hour, she did not give in. She clutched her rifle as though it anchored her to reality. She tended the fire with hands raw and bleeding. She moved through the timber, setting and checking traps, though she staggered as she walked, though her vision swam, though the silence pressed like a noose around her throat. Her spirit flickered like a candle in storm wind, fragile, wavering, but not yet extinguished. The wilderness wanted her mind. It wanted her will. It wanted her to forget she was alive, to sink into snow and silence and fade without a sound. But she would not surrender. Not yet. Not while her breath still smoked in the cold air. Not while her heart still beat its weary rhythm. Isolation clawed at her spirit, but her spirit still endured. And though the wilderness whispered that she was already lost, she whispered back, if only in thought, if only in defiance, not yet. The young frontier woman stood on the edge of collapse, her stomach hollow, her ribs sharp, her thoughts drifting like smoke. The wilderness had pressed her into a corner, and only one thing remained: raw, desperate ingenuity. When strength failed, she turned to craft. When supplies dwindled, she turned to invention. When hunger grew unbearable, she turned to the knowledge buried deep within her bones. The first task was food. Her traps stood empty, her lines broken by storms, her bait frozen useless. She studied the land for new chances. She found the tracks of ptarmigan, faint against the snow. With hands stiff and clumsy, she gathered thin willow shoots, bent them, and carved them into crude snares. She strung them across the birds' trails, hidden beneath powder. Hours passed, the wind howled, her body sagged, but when she returned, a single bird fluttered weakly in her snare. Small, frail, barely a mouthful, but it was life. She plucked it, roasted it over weak coals, and swallowed the meat in slow, reverent bites. each mouthful a victory, each swallow defiance against the void. Water was another battle. The river was dangerous now, its ice treacherous, its current a death trap, but snow alone gave nothing, sapping heat from her body. So she built a crude basin from birch bark, lined with mud, propped near the fire. Snow melted into liquid there, warm enough to drink. A simple craft, but it spared her precious fuel, spared her the endless labor of boiling. Her fire, too, demanded cunning. The storm-wet wood smoked, hissed, and died. She remembered then the resin of pine, thick, sticky, hidden beneath bark. She scraped it with her knife, fingers numb, gathering enough to light even damp timber. It smoked heavy, but it burned hot, and the flames returned, strong enough to warm her brittle bones. Every task became invention, every hour a puzzle. She carved hooks from bone, strung thin lines from sinew, set them beneath ice holes to catch what fish might drift near. She hardened strips of hide into makeshift containers, carried coals wrapped in moss to save matches. She cut a hollow in the snowbank for shelter, layered with evergreen boughs, its walls thick against the wind, its roof low to trap heat. The wilderness fought her at every step, but she answered with craft, and as her body weakened, her mind sharpened. Hunger drove her to think deeper. Desperation carved her focus into steel. Where others might have surrendered, she looked to the smallest chance, the narrowest thread, the tiniest spark of survival. Yet ingenuity alone was not enough. Her hands shook as she worked. Her breath came shallow. She knew she could not invent food where none existed, could not conjure strength from air. But each trick gave her another day. Each day gave her another chance. The wilderness tried to smother her fire. She answered with resin. The wilderness tried to steal her water. She answered with bark and basin. The wilderness tried to starve her. She answered with snare and sinew. Every victory was small, every gain fleeting, but survival was built on small victories, and though her body cried for rest, though her mind strained beneath silence, she pressed on. One evening she crouched within her snow shelter, fire flickering at the entrance, a thin stream of smoke curling into the sky. Her belly held only a bird's worth of meat and bitter pine tea, yet she felt something stir inside her, a faint ember of strength. She had beaten back the wilderness for another day. Her hands ached, her bones burned, her face hollowed, but still she endured. She endured because she refused to vanish quietly into the snow. She endured because the land would not have her yet. She endured because desperate ingenuity had carved her one more chance. And in the stillness of that night, with wind howling beyond her shelter, she understood something. The wilderness was vast. The wilderness was merciless. The wilderness was built to erase the weak. But she was not weak. Not while her hands could work. Not while her mind could scheme. Not while the spark of endurance still burned in her chest. The wilderness had underestimated her. She knew her ingenuity had bought her days, but not salvation. The fire still burned, the snow shelter still stood, the crude snares still caught scraps of life, but scraps would not be enough. Her body continued to wither. Her strength waned each morning. She could feel her ribs pressing sharper against her skin, her knees trembling with every step. Small victories had carried her this far, but survival demanded more, and the wilderness did not hand out mercy. It had to be taken. She rose one grey morning with frost in her hair, her breath thin, her stomach aching so fiercely it twisted her spine. Her traps had yielded nothing in 3 days. Her last scraps of hide broth had vanished into emptiness. And now she understood with terrifying clarity. If she did not act soon, if she did not risk everything on a greater chance, she would fade into the snow before the week's end. So she chose the gamble. The forest held larger prey. Deer, elk, even caribou moved through these frozen valleys, rare, swift and cautious, but they carried enough meat to save her for weeks, perhaps longer. Hunting one was madness for a lone, starving woman. Madness because a single misstep could waste her last strength. Madness because failure would leave her too weak to rise again. But starvation left no choice. She studied the tracks in the snow, faint depressions trailing along the timberline, not rabbit, not fox, hooves, heavy, careful, pressing deep through frost. An elk had passed here perhaps 2 nights past. She followed, slow and deliberate, her snowshoes whispering across the crusted surface. Every step felt like a theft of her remaining strength. Every step felt like a debt she would soon be forced to pay. Hours stretched, the sky dimmed, the wind sharpened. Her breath grew ragged, but at last she saw it. Movement ahead, broad shoulders shifting between the trees. An elk. Thin from winter, ribs faint beneath its hide, but still a mountain of flesh compared to her dwindling frame. Her heart pounded. Her hands shook as she gripped her rifle. This was it. This was life or death. If she missed, if the animal fled, she would never have strength to pursue. This was her one chance. She crouched low, steadying the rifle against a tree. Her vision blurred with hunger. Her breath came in gasps. She blinked hard, willing her body to obey. She aimed not at the massive form, but at the one place that mattered. The chest, just behind the shoulder, where a true shot would pierce deep. The wilderness fell silent, even the wind seemed to pause. Her finger tightened, the rifle cracked. The shot echoed like thunder across the valley. Snow cascaded from branches. The elk jerked, stumbled, then bolted, crashing through timber with staggering force. For a heartbeat, despair filled her chest. She thought it had fled, that her shot had failed. But then, blood, dark streaks across the snow. She forced her body forward, stumbling through drifts, following the crimson trail. Her lungs burned, her legs quivered. She nearly fell again and again, but she pushed onward. And there, at last, the elk lay in the snow. Its sides heaved shallowly, its eyes glazed with frost. It shuddered once, twice, then stilled. The young woman dropped to her knees. Relief struck her so sharply it felt like pain. Tears froze on her lashes. She pressed her forehead to the snow, her body shaking with exhaustion, with hunger, with raw, desperate triumph. She had done it. Against every odd, against her own fading strength, she had taken the gamble, and it had saved her. But survival demanded more. The kill was only the beginning. She drew her knife with trembling hands, cut deep into the hide, carved strips of meat even as the cold stiffened the body. She worked until her arms ached, until her fingers bled, until she had gathered enough to carry. She built a small fire nearby, roasted the first piece, and swallowed it slowly, reverently. The taste filled her mouth, rich and warm. Strength seeped back into her limbs. Her body, once hollow, felt fire again. She ate until her stomach cramped, then wrapped the rest in frozen bundles, hiding them beneath snow for preservation. That night, she returned to her shelter with meat enough for days, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without the gnaw of hunger clawing at her ribs. But survival is never free. The gamble had won her food, but the wilderness had heard her shot. The sound carried far, and where the echo rang, predators listened. The feast was not hers alone. The elk had given her life, meat enough to drive back the gnawing hunger, strength enough to rise each morning without collapse. But survival was never free. Every victory in the wilderness carried a cost, and the cost of this kill would soon be revealed. The shot had echoed across valleys of snow and timber, ringing through frozen air like a beacon. The scent of blood carried farther still, drifting on the wind, heavy and unmistakable. In the wild, nothing goes unnoticed. The wolves came first. Their tracks appeared near the carcass the next morning, pressed deep into fresh snow. Wide paws, sharp claws, circling. She studied the marks with tightening chest. They had come in the night, sniffed, tested, lingered. She had been spared only because she had dragged her share of meat back to her shelter before dark. But the carcass itself, what remained of it, was no longer hers. The wolves had claimed it. That night, She heard them. Their howls rose with the moon, long, low, and haunting. Not one voice but many, weaving together into a chorus that froze the blood. They were close, too close. The fire at her shelter's mouth flickered weakly against the dark, and every time the wind carried their song, she gripped her rifle tighter, her body rigid with fear. The wilderness had grown teeth. The next days became a battle of caution. She rationed her meat carefully, eating only enough to keep strength. She dared not return to the carcass. The wolves owned it now. Their tracks deepened each morning. Their howls echoed each night. She was not alone anymore, but her company was death itself. One morning, as grey dawn bled across the horizon, she stepped out from her shelter and saw them, shapes on the ridge above, 5, maybe 6. Shadows moving against the snow, watching her. Their eyes glowed faint, their bodies lean and hungry. They made no sound, but their silence was worse than howls. She returned quickly to her shelter, her heart pounding, her breath sharp. She fed the fire high, piling resin and sticks until smoke curled thick. She kept the rifle across her knees, her knife at her side. She knew the truth. The wolves were patient. They would not charge her fire, not yet. But hunger drove them as surely as it drove her, and winter made every creature ruthless. That night she barely slept. The fire hissed low, and outside she heard them padding closer, circling. Once she saw a shape dart past the firelight, low, quick, silent as wind. Her skin prickled. Her hands shook around the rifle. They were testing her, probing for weakness. By dawn, the tracks were everywhere. Around the shelter, across her trail, leading into the timber where they had watched. They had followed her every step. The wilderness had turned hunter, and now she was the prey. But she would not yield. She rose that morning and sharpened her knife. She reinforced the shelter walls with packed snow, higher, thicker, harder to breach. She cut long branches into stakes, planting them outward in crude defenses. She gathered her meat, stacking it close, covering it with snow to mask the scent. She worked through fear, through exhaustion, through trembling hands. Because she knew what was coming. The wolves had time. They would wait. They would starve her of sleep, bleed her of courage. And when her fire burned low, when her guard broke, when her strength failed, they would strike. That night, the howls rose again, nearer than ever, echoing through the timber like a death song. Her fire cracked, her breath hissed white, her eyes wide against the dark. She knew they were out there, eyes glowing just beyond the light. The predator's shadow had fallen, and the wilderness was no longer patient. The wolves had circled her for days, watching, waiting, testing her resolve with each long howl that echoed through the timber. She had felt them in her bones, their presence like a shadow pressed against her back. But shadows cannot circle forever. Hunger drives even the patient to action, and hunger drove the wolves to strike. The night was bitter cold. The wind carried the sharp scent of snow and blood. Her fire sputtered low, embers glowing like watchful eyes. She sat with her rifle across her lap, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her spirit taut as a drawn bowstring. Then she heard it, the crunch of snow, soft, measured, not the weight of wind or the crack of tree, but paws, many paws, moving closer. Her heart surged. Her grip tightened. Her breath came sharp and shallow. The first shape slid into the edge of firelight, low to the ground, its fur bristling silver in the glow. Eyes like coals fixed on her. It bared its teeth, breath steaming in the cold. Behind it, more shadows moved. 6, 7, a pack. They did not rush. They approached in silence, spreading wide, circling their bodies ghosts between the trees. The fire hissed, but its circle of light was small. Beyond it, the dark belonged to the wolves. She rose slowly, steadying the rifle. The wolves padded closer, their eyes burned, their growls rumbled low, vibrating through the ground. Then, the charge. One leapt, a blur of teeth and muscle. The rifle cracked, the shot shattering the silence. Snow burst red, and the wolf collapsed in a heap. The pack scattered back for a breath, but only a breath. Hunger overcame fear. The howls rose, furious and wild, and they surged again. She seized a burning branch from the fire and swung it wide, sparks flying, smoke choking the air. A wolf darted close, snapping, its teeth clashing inches from her arm. She thrust the fire into its face. It yelped, retreated, but another lunged from the side. She slashed with her knife, steel tearing through fur, hot blood spraying against her skin. The pack pressed harder, the fire roared higher, the night exploded in chaos. Her shelter shook as bodies slammed against it, snow cascading from its walls. Claws raked the frozen ground, teeth snapped in the dark. She stumbled, nearly fell, her legs quivering from weakness, but she fought with every scrap of will. Rifle, fire, knife, every tool, every instinct, every ounce of fury. She stabbed, she swung, she screamed into the night with rage that matched their howls. Blood spattered across the snow, Wolf's and her own. Her arms bore shallow cuts, her clothes torn, her breath ragged. Still she fought, still she defied. And at last, the fire turned the tide. She fed it high with resin, with branches, with anything that would burn. Flames leapt tall, painting the night in orange fury. The wolves snarled but faltered, pacing at the edge of light. Their hunger was great, but their fear grew greater. One limped, wounded, another lay still, silent forever. The others circled once more, howled their rage to the moon, and melted back into the timber. The silence that followed was crushing. Her hands shook violently as she lowered her rifle. Her breath tore through her chest. Her eyes stung with sweat and smoke. Blood trickled down her arm, but she did not fall. She stood before the fire, alone, trembling, yet alive. The wilderness had sent its teeth. She had met them, and she had endured. But survival demanded more than victory. She knew they would return if she faltered. She knew her wounds would fester if untreated. She knew her strength, though tested, was not endless. Still, she had faced the night of teeth, and the wilderness had not taken her. Not yet. The wolves were gone, but their shadows lingered. Their paw prints scarred the snow around her shelter, mingling with the red stains of blood. Smoke drifted from the fire, curling into the pale sky. She stood in silence, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavy upon her shoulders. Her breath rose in ragged clouds, her eyes hollow, her body trembling with each heartbeat. She had survived the night of teeth, but survival was never the end. It was always the beginning of another struggle. Her wounds burned, shallow cuts searing against the cold. Her arms felt weak, her legs heavier than stone. Yet she forced herself to move, forced herself to gather wood, to stack it high upon the fire. The blaze grew again, a shield against the darkness, a fragile promise of life. As the sun crept over the ridges, the land revealed itself once more, endless, white, merciless. The silence of the wilderness was broken only by the groan of trees and the distant cry of a raven circling overhead. She felt the echo of her own solitude pressing in. She was small, she was fragile, but she was not finished. Her supplies were nearly gone. The snares she had set lay empty, disturbed by the chaos of the wolves. The little meat she had managed to save was tainted with blood, scattered, ruined. Her hunger clawed at her belly, sharp and insistent. Still, she endured. She set her traps again, each movement slow, deliberate, her hands shaking but steady enough to work. She melted snow in her pot, sipping water that soothed her cracked throat. She bound her wounds with strips of cloth torn from her own garments. Every action was pain, every step was weariness. Yet every action was defiance. The wilderness did not care if she lived or died. That truth she had long accepted. The storm had not cared. The wolves had not cared. The cold, the hunger, the endless silence, none of it bent for her sake, and yet she cared. That was her weapon. That was her fire. Day turned to night again, and she sat by the flames, her body shaking, her spirit raw. She thought of what had carried her this far, not strength alone, but will, not food or fire alone, but the refusal to surrender. The wilderness had whispered for her to lie down, to close her eyes, to give herself over to the snow. But she had not listened. She would not listen. Then came a moment of grace. At dawn, one of her traps held life. A hare, small and trembling, but enough. She killed it quickly, her hands steady despite her weakness. She cooked it over her fire, the smell of meat filling the air, a fragile victory against the emptiness. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, her body absorbing strength, her spirit absorbing hope. It was not a feast. It was not salvation. But it was life. The days that followed blurred into one long battle. Cold mornings, silent nights, wounds aching, fire sputtering, hunger gnawing. Yet she endured them all. Her body thinned, her face sharpened, but her eyes burned brighter with each passing day. She was not merely surviving, she was refusing to die. And then, at last, she felt it. The faintest shift. The days grew longer, the wind less sharp, the snow softened beneath the sun. The wilderness was still vast, still merciless, but it was changing. She had outlasted the worst. One evening, as the sky burned with streaks of crimson and gold, she stood outside her shelter and looked across the endless horizon. Her breath rose in soft clouds. Her scars throbbed with memory. Her heart pounded with endurance. She whispered nothing. She shouted nothing. She only stood, scarred, hungry, weathered, but unbroken. The wilderness had taken much from her: blood, flesh, sleep, comfort. But it had not taken her spirit. And that was her triumph. Not rescue, not comfort, but survival. The echo of endurance carried through her veins, through the smoke of her fire, through the endless ridges of the wild. A young frontier woman, alone, battered, scarred, had faced the wilderness at its fiercest, and she still stood. That was enough, and the wild would remember. And so, when the fire dimmed and the wolves slipped back into the timber, she still stood, scarred, bloodied, but unbroken. Her spirit had endured when the wilderness itself tried to claim her. And just like her fire, this channel grows brighter with your support. So strike a spark, like this tale, subscribe for more frontier survival stories, and comment below where you are watching from. And when you're ready to ride into the next story, the trail waits just ahead. Click the video on your screen and continue the journey.